Thank you.
Thank you.
So what is, again, self-consciousness? Is this, in the way in which we talk about it, is this deliberate act of self-reflection carried out through discursive thought? So let me give you an example. I say that I am self-conscious when I deliberately think of what I have said, what I have done, or what I'm feeling or I felt. And in this thinking of mine, in this reflective thinking of mine, I put together certain narrations regarding myself. Okay? That's self-consciousness, the way in which we speak about it. And it is indeed self-consciousness. It is a manifestation of self-consciousness. Is this clear to everybody? This is clearly a manifestation of self-consciousness. Okay, and that's the way in which, when we think of it, we understand self-consciousness. However,
if it is discursive thought, then does it mean it has to be carried out in some sort of clear discourse?
Yeah, it has to be carried out in a as a system of propositions, whereby I say, "Oh, yesterday I felt down because that person told me blah 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 blah, and I reacted to that particular word that he or she said in this way, and I reacted in this way because it reminded me of something that occurred to me, even though at the moment, right then and there, I was not aware of this. But now that I think about it, I realize that yes, that word has brought up certain memories and blah 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 blah, and that's why then I felt the way I felt." Okay, this is a discursive.
So if a person is not very clear of his own thoughts, then he's not very.
What again?
So if the person is not very aware of his own thoughts clearly.
No, the discursive thought is the moment in which you try to make clarity, to get clear about your own thoughts, your own feelings, your own ideas, and so on and so forth. Okay, this discursive thought is the systematization of thought in propositions. Okay, whereby you chain propositions in a certain way. Okay, now self-consciousness, understood in its most layman kind of way, okay, or not layman, but understood at its most apparent level, self-consciousness is nothing but an act of self-reflection carried out through discursive thought. Okay, that's what self-consciousness is, at least if we look at it at the staying just at the superficial level.
So when you observe something and you just observe it like when there is no verbal reflection, like it's just a completely non-verbal thing, like when I observe a fan, so on and so forth, then it's not called self-consciousness?
No, I mean, that's the point. That's the point. Verbal utterances are not needed, at least at the first as the first step. Meaning, the discursive thought I referred to you to before, which I defined as a system of propositions, is already a second step. But the moment I look at something, there is already self-consciousness there, because
so
I'm not
appearing. So when the thing, so when you look, so at the stage when you just look at something and it appears to you in a certain way, there's already self-consciousness there.
Of course, because there is already a distance between you and the thing. What allows that thing to appear to you as a thing is the fact that there is a distance between you and it. Okay, so that thing appears to you as something, and you react to this something. You react. I mean, behave in a certain way towards this something. There is already there consciousness. Consciousness is already there. It's not self-consciousness. Okay? It's not self-consciousness, it's consciousness. Self-consciousness comes at the moment in which you yourself become an object of observation to yourself. So when I go through something, I'm conscious of what I'm going through, but I'm not thinking about my relation to the thing. Self-consciousness instead is the moment in which I think about my relation to the thing. Is that clear?
Yes.
So there are two moments in consciousness. Now, consciousness, as I told you already 2 days ago, consciousness, in the sense of awareness, is a characteristic trait of all living things. Life is always, to a certain extent, aware. Why can we say that? Well, because anything that is alive, anything that lives, reacts to the environment. That reacting is possible because of this fundamental trait of each living thing, which is awareness. So William says, I think self-consciousness seems to loosely refer to an ability to look at yourself in a third-person perspective. Yes, that's self-consciousness. Self-consciousness is the ability to look at yourself as someone else, which is, by the way, something that only the human being is capable of doing. Only the human being has self-consciousness. Okay? That's why all the, I open a parenthesis here, I'm digressing a bit, but just for you to be put on the right path. That's why all the experiments carried out by neuroscientists and neuropsychologists are fundamentally idiotic. When they say, oh, when you are in love, this and this, you are in love because this and this particles, chemical particles react in your brain, and hence you get in love, you fall in love, right? Okay, so tell me, dear neuroscientist, who am I? The one who undergoes the chemical reaction of those particles, or the one who knows that he's undergoing the chemical reaction of those particles? Which is the same question as saying, who am I? The one who's sexually aroused, or the one who knows that he's sexually aroused? I am the one who knows, not the one who's sexually aroused. So am I fully determined by chemical reactions? No. Because I have this ability to step outside of them and look at it as if from the outside, which is the most outside, is more outside than any physical outside. Okay, so self-consciousness is precisely this ability to look at oneself as if from a third perspective. And we do that, we human beings, we do that all the time. All the time. The main place in which this displacement takes place, well, sorry for the involuntary play on words. I mean, the main place in which this displacement takes place, it's quite confusing, but in any case, the main sphere, let's say that, in which this displacement occurs is language. human self-consciousness happens in language. As we said before, discursive thought. Discursive thought is a thought that is organized linguistically. And human thinking can happen only in language. No language, no thinking. Okay? Now, let's go back. We said that self-consciousness is a human trait, but as such is founded on consciousness. You must have consciousness, first of all. And consciousness is awareness, ultimately. Now, the human being is not the only possessor of awareness, as you know. All the living things have awareness. My dog has awareness. In fact, when it comes to awareness, understood as sensorial perception, my dog is much more aware than I am. A shark is much more aware than my dog will ever be in water. An eagle is much more aware of the terrain than I, my dog, and many other creatures will ever be, right? And this thing of awareness is not limited only to complex systems of perception, such as the one of the eagle, the dog, the cat, and so on and so forth. But it extends to anything that lives. If you poke a cell, that cell moves. So it is aware. If instead I poke the table, literally speaking, I can't even poke the table because there is nothing to be poked there. Think of it. Can you say, I poke the table? Does it make sense? No, right? You can say, I exercise pressure on the table. I press the table. But you cannot say, I poke the table. But you can say, I poke the door. When you have a door with a yeast inside and a living thing inside, you can say, I poke the door, and the door comes back because it's alive. So it reacts, right? But if I were to say, I poke, I don't know, I poke a cube of solidified flour, you're pressing it, you're not poking it, you can't poke it. And you can't poke it, not because the material is not soft, because you can't poke even a gumball. It doesn't make sense to poke, to say, I poke a gumball. You poke only what is alive, that is to say, what has the ability to react, what is conscious of being touched. That's what poking is, interacting with something that is conscious of being touched. So you can do that with a dog. I can poke my dog, which is something I don't do because my dog is very, it tends to be quite irascible. So I don't want to mess with him. Credi? So any living thing is conscious. Then on this basic thing that is consciousness knows different levels, different gradations, if you will. And in the human being, it reaches the level of self-consciousness, okay? Self-consciousness, which is something that goes beyond direct sense perception and rests instead in verbal production, which is the seed, verbal production, for any thought. Okay, good. So we have consciousness and self-consciousness. Does Plotinus know the distinction between these two things? Yes, he does. He calls consciousness with different names. One is synesthesis, which means literally consciousness, that is to say, seen with con, aesthesis, sensation. So an intense continuous sensation, an intense continuous sensation. He calls it synesis, which also means going together, or so being gathered together. Synemi comes from the verb synemi, which means I go together. Synesis, synesis, and the other one that he uses, it escapes me now. But in any case, he has the notion of consciousness. Does he have the notion of self-consciousness? Yes. How does he call it? He calls it parakoluthima. Parakoluthima means to follow side by side. Akolutho in Greek means to follow. Para means on the side. So to follow on the side of. On the side of what? Of consciousness. In the passage we read in chapter 4, of which one is he talking? He's talking about consciousness, not about self-consciousness. And what he's saying is what I just told you, namely that anything that lives, insofar as it lives, has consciousness, but not only a consciousness of things that happen to it, hence is not pure reaction, but some kind of dim perception whereby it keeps itself together. If you read my commentary, I refer in the commentary at a certain point to the concept of ikiosis, which I have translated with appropriation or with familiarization. And let me see what it is. Oh, I cannot find it now. In any case. Well, in any case, the point here is that what Plotinus is trying to say is that before any sensorial act, which is determined by the interaction with an outside, there is in anything that lives what we can call a dim self-consciousness. Let me give you an example. Of course, my dog, at least as far as we can observe, doesn't unfold any discursive thought about himself. So it doesn't seem to have any discursive self-consciousness. Nobody has ever seen a dog displaying a behavior such as make one think that the dog was thinking about himself. All right, so that's clear. However, my dog does anything in its power to keep itself well, to maintain its being. So every living thing insofar as it keeps itself together continuously, displays what Plotinus calls synesthesis, a sort of consciousness that keeps the thing together. This is a concept that has been used also in psychology and in biology, above all in the first half of the 20th century. And when I talk about the concept of ikiosis, which Plotinus uses in chapter 5, I make reference to these usages of this concept. Let me see if I can find. Oh man. I don't manage to find that reference to the more recent usage of this concept. Well, be as it may, you have it in my commentary. Now, this process whereby each living thing keeps itself together and has some sort of pre-discursive knowledge of itself. Mark my words, pre-discursive knowledge of itself. Plotinus calls ikiosis. Ikiosis, let me write it down. Which I've translated as familiarization, appropriation. You'll find it in the commentary. By the way, let me ask you this. Are you reading also the commentary? Because much of what I say, you can find already there, okay? Good. So let's go back to the question. Is self-consciousness decreasing as we go down the ladder of realities? If by self-consciousness we understand this primeval familiarization that each thing has to itself, then yes, as we go down the ladder of realities, that self-consciousness understood as familiarization and appropriation of each thing to and of itself decreases. If by and you know, by default it means that the higher the reality, the higher that kind of self-consciousness that we call synesthesis and ikiosis. Synesthesis that ends up in an ikiosis. If instead, by self-consciousness, we understand what we normally understand with the word, namely discursive thought, which reflects on one's acts, one's words, one's feelings. If we understand that with the notion of self-consciousness, and let me say it again, this is a characteristic only of the human being. If we understand that, then as we go down the ladder of realities, we see the appearance of self-consciousness. And which one is the living thing that has the most of self-consciousness? The human being. Hence, the human being is the most problematic being, because it's the one that displays the least that ikiosis, that consciousness understood as familiarization and appropriation of itself. The human being lives, Plotinus would say, in parakoluthima, that is to say, in this following, in this side following of itself, looking at itself as if from the outside. But by virtue of that, the human being lives in an alienated way. So the difference between me and my dog is that the dog possesses or is possessed by an immediacy of life that I do not have. So self-consciousness, understood as that act of self-reflection and self-awareness that unfolds in a discursive thought, is the manifestation of, Plotinus says even in a passage of the Ennead, of a sick part of being, of reality. And which one is the sick part of being? The human being. Plotinus makes an example at a certain point. He says, when is it that we become aware that we have fingers? When the finger hurts, or when the finger is wounded, then we become aware that we have a finger. Otherwise, I'm not aware that I have a finger. Whereby aware, Plotinus means self-conscious. I don't think about my fingers, I use them. And the more I am healthy and sane, by saying, you must understand, whole, right? The more I'm whole, the less I think about my body parts. And the less I think about them, the more I can operate through them. The less whole I am, the more I need to think of those parts that are problematic. So self-consciousness understood as self-reflection, and hence a discourse unfolded about oneself, is for Plotinus, is thought of by Plotinus as the sign of a constant process of alienation in which the human being is immersed. Now, this opens up a very interesting field of reflections on what the human being is for Plotinus, on the one hand, but starting from that, on what kind of philosophical project Plotinus is proposing. I told you already that any philosophy is the making explicit of a project in which the human being willy-nilly is involved. The difference between science and philosophy, one can see, for example, in this fact that even though science does propose a project regarding how to be human and what it means to be human, although science does do that, science is not conscious of it. Science doesn't think about it. Philosophy instead does, and does so explicitly. So this thing about discursive self-consciousness being the manifestation of a state of alienation typical of the human being opens up an avenue of thought regarding what kind of project Plotinus has for the human being. Is that clear? So let's go back to the question. Yes, as we go down to the ladder of realities, what decreases is self-consciousness, understood as the primary and foundational deep awareness that each living thing has of itself, an awareness that precedes any discourse. An awareness that culminates in what Plotinus calls, with a Stoic term, much probably, ikiosis, familiarization. So the higher up you go in the ladder of realities, the higher, the more intense this ikiosis will be. If instead, by self-consciousness, we understand the act of self-reflecting discursive thought, then the further away you go from the highest realities, the more you see the manifestation of self-consciousness understood as an act of self-reflecting discursive thought, which Plotinus calls in Greek parakoluthima. Okay. Where do we see this this parakoluthima happening in the most evident way? In the human being. Hence, the human being is the manifestation of a highly problematic part of reality, a part that Plotinus doesn't hesitate to call sick. I hope this clarifies this thing about self-consciousness. So when it comes back to the power of growth, what does Plotinus say about the power of growth? It says that, yes, of course, the power of growth has synesthesis, has that primeval self-consciousness that doesn't need discursive thought. And it culminates in ikiosis, in self-familiarity.
So in this way, the power of growth keeps inanimate objects the way they are. It's like it keeps a rock as a rock through its awareness of what a rock is.
Yeah, but again, it's not an awareness in the sense of being able to discern discursively. Is a possessing. In fact, the other type of vocabulary that Plotinus employs in this context is that of possession. Echin in Greek, to have, to possess. What does he say? He says that the more a reality possesses itself, I feel an echo. The more a reality possesses itself, the less it needs to reflect upon itself. The more secure of what it does it is. Think of it in these terms. Imagine that you are writing, right? The moment you start thinking about the fact that you are writing, you are conscious of the fact that you are writing, correct? Am I right?
Yes.
But when you start thinking about the fact that you are writing, can you keep writing?
No, you can't. It's just like doing anything.
We can what?
Exactly.
We can.
What?
We can keep writing while we are thinking about writing what?
Can you keep writing when you think of the fact that you're writing?
I think we can. So every time.
No, you can't. No, you can't, because when you write, you are writing about something. So what you are doing, you are concentrating on the thing that you're writing about, not on the writing itself. Try to do that. Try to write anything, not thinking about what you're writing about, but thinking about the fact that you're writing.
then you, okay. So for example,
It's the same for anything else. I mean, think of it. Can you have sex if you're thinking about the fact that you're having sex? No. Can you enjoy a dish if you are thinking about the fact that you are putting the spoon in your mouth? No. In other words, what Plotinus is saying, let me finish this, is that what we call self-consciousness in the sense of self-reflecting discursiveness is a detachment from the unfolding of whatever we are involved in. And he thinks of it as a sign of sickness, as a sign of the inability to live and unfold through a certain manner of operating. Okay? Now, question.
Prof, I think I do not disagree that when you think about something, you can't do it. I'll give one fine example of meditation. You are aware of your breathing, but you can breathe at the same time. You are aware you're meditating, but you can meditate at the same time. You are aware that you are sitting, but you can sit at the same time. And I think writing is not a complicated task that you cannot do it while you think about it.
Okay, let me tell you this. When you think of the fact that you're breathing, right, you are not thinking of it. You are concentrating on it, which is different. You are trying to become one with it. I've done breathing exercises, which are typical also of the Christian tradition. What you're trying to do there is not to think about the fact that you're breathing. You are emptying all thoughts and you are becoming one with the act of breathing. There is no self-consciousness there. Be careful. Meditation is not an act of self-consciousness. Meditation is an act of immersion into something. Chinese calligraphy is an act of meditation in that sense, because in order for you to draw beautiful signs, what you have to be able to do is to become one with the brush. If you think instead of the fact that, oh, I have to do first this and then that, you won't do it. That's why Chinese calligraphy was practiced as an art, not for the sake of producing scripts that then you hang on the wall, but for the sake of learning how to become one with the action that you are unfolding. So in a way, what Plotinus says about self-consciousness is deeply true, meaning the moment you start thinking about what you're doing, you are not doing that thing anymore. And the human being lives mostly in self-consciousness, okay? And then he goes on to equate this state to a state of sickness. In a sense, it's true what he says, and is something that anybody can subscribe to. On the other hand, though, by labeling discursive self-consciousness as a sign of sickness, Plotinus is de facto putting a bad label on the human phenomenon per se. Okay, so here we touch a point of extreme problematicity of Plotinus' thought. But I hope I clarified and I sort of quenched your objections regarding the fact that one can think about what is doing and do it at the same time. Let me repeat it. When you meditate, you are not thinking about the fact that you are breathing. You're becoming one with the breath. Otherwise, you are not doing the exercise correctly.
Yes, I think that is very true, because a common feature of proper meditation is that you tend to lose track of time, and when you emerge from it.
Yeah. Yeah, but time is tightly linked to self-consciousness. self-consciousness understood as discursive thought. Because, I mean, time is organized as a discourse between the before, the now, and the then, right? If you lose track of that, you are outside of discursive thought. If you are outside of discursive thought, you are outside of self-consciousness understood as discursive thought. So you are instead in what Plotinus would call ikiosis. You become familiar, you become one with your breath. You become one with your act of writing. You become one with your act of running. You can, by the way, this is an experience that you don't need to be a monk to do. If some of you goes running or goes swimming, right? I go running every day. It happens, I've noticed it. When I start thinking, oh, I'm running, I'm tired of running, when is the 45th minute gonna arrive, and blah, 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 I run in a worse way. When instead, I don't think about anything, I just run, I feel elated. And once, you know, the alarm says 45th minute, I'm sometimes even surprised. I'm like, oh, we're there already, right? And those are the days in which my exercise is satisfactory, I say in English, satisfies me and makes me feel that I've done something, right? In any case, the point of contention here is not to establish whether we can think about something and do it at the same time, because I think it's pretty clear that we can't, right? The point here to understand is that when it comes to self-consciousness understood as an act of discursive thought, Plotinus thinks that this is a sign of sickness, typical hence of a reality, namely the human reality, that has detached itself from the higher realities more than anything else, okay? Now, Koktong has a question.
Hi, Prof. So I'm actually very, very curious why Plotinus has that view. Is it related to the first paragraph that you talk about, the provocative introduction that Plotinus uses?
Well, why does he have regarding the human being, you say?
Yes, the paradoxical thesis. Is it related?
Yeah, well, it doesn't have to do with that directly, but it has to do with a deep tendency of Plotinus' thought. What is this tendency? Is part of his discourse regarding the one. This discourse regarding the one is, to a very important and deep extent, linked to the desire of Plotinus to truly be united with the totality of things, okay? And for him, what one should strive towards is precisely that, get reunited with the totality of things, overcome the kind of breach that the human being always feels between himself and the rest of things. That's one important aspect of Plotinus' thought. And in this talking of the human being as a sick part of reality, I think that's what's at work. So it's not directly directed to the paradoxical thesis of the beginning of the treatise, albeit, of course, it has to do with it. The paradoxical thesis has to do more with a challenging of certain tenets of the tradition as they were received by him, okay? Now, I see certain questions being posed by William. I want to say that when a toddler has not yet learned the language, it shares the same immediacy of life that a dog would. Okay, you all see the question that William posed. That's a good question. Now, that brings us to a problem, which is the problem of anthropogenesis. Let me write it down. Anthropogenesis, that is to say, the coming into being of the human being. Now, when we talk about the coming into being of the human being, we must understand that we're talking about something radically different from the coming into being of a dog or a cat. Why is that? Well, because the human being is a problematic creature. Is a creature that says I, and no the creature says I. Is a creature that says I will die. So is a creature that is conscious of its end, and no the creature is conscious of its own end. The question then is, how and when does this emerge? If we say that toddlers maybe don't have that, we are then supposing that there is a moment in which the human being, for some kind of reason and through some kind of unknown phenomenon, becomes human. That is to say, becomes capable of saying I, of saying I will die, and blah, 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 blah. So in that sense, toddlers, before they become able to say that, are closer to animals, hence they have a more immediate relation to things. Maybe, or maybe not. Maybe the human being, one human being, is already born with a level of self-consciousness that from the very start allows this creature to, albeit in a dim way, perceive and understand him or herself as him or herself. That's unclear, okay? But it has to do with the problem of anthropogenesis. How does the human being come into existence? And look, this is a very serious problem. It's a very serious problem. The naive way to answer this problem is the one that AI rides on. Namely, the human being becomes human being because it accumulates data in a more efficient way than other creatures. False. There are tons of creatures out there that are able to accumulate data that we can't even dream of. But they're not intelligent. They're not intelligent in the way in which we are intelligent. They don't have self-consciousness, okay? Nobody has ever seen a dog pondering about himself or building a shrine for a previously deceased dog, which tells us that the dog has no consciousness either of itself or its own death or the death of other dogs. So there are multiple very easily observable signs of the fact that other creatures don't live in the sphere of awareness that the human being lives in. So the answer given by the various neurosciences on which then AI builds the discourse around itself are completely insufficient, and in fact, if you ask me, quite naive, not to say idiotic, okay? Other answers, which are already more sophisticated and more plausible, are the ones given, for example, by paleontologists, that is to say, by those scholars who study the beginning of human civilizations. And how is it that the paleontologist identifies a human settlement as opposed to a baboon recovery place? Well, by seeing whether there are any signs of burial. Where there are signs of burial, there you're dealing with a human being. So if you find a tomb, you know that in that place human beings lived. And so the paleontologists say, well, the moment we started burying, we became human beings. okay? But this doesn't tell us how we started bearing. What kind of thing happened that made us realize that death is a thing, and hence we buried the dead? This question remains unanswered. Another approach is the one proposed by the Italian philosopher, let me write it down to you. You can find many of his videos online, by the way. I suggest, I recommend you to watch them. Giorgio Agamben. His books have been translated in English, and is one of the must-know names of current philosophical discourse, Giorgio Agamben. Giorgio Agamben proposes something more sensible, at least to my mind, and he says the process of anthropogenesis is not something that has happened once for all. It's a process that keeps happening. So we become human beings. We are in the middle of the task of becoming, human more and more. The point is, what is this task precisely? But that's now another discourse. I don't want to start that problem, because that's going to take us very far from Plotinus. In any case, as far as Plotinus is concerned, let me reiterate what I already said several times. Self-consciousness understood as that primeval awareness of itself is something that any living thing has. And thanks to it, that living thing operates perfectly as that thing. Hence, the higher the reality, the tighter the manner of being, the deeper this kind of primeval self-awareness. The lower the reality, the more dispersed and disgregated the manner of being, the dimmer and the less effective that kind of awareness, which Plotinus calls ikiosis, familiarization. If instead we're talking of self-consciousnness in terms of discursive thought, then that's a prerogative of the human being, and Plotinus looks at it disfavorably as a sign of the fact that the human being represents a sick part of reality, a symptom of human beings' detachment from things, and hence a sign, furthermore, of the fact that the human being is not able to operate at unison with its being and with the being of totality. Okay. All right. So Cocteau has another question.
I don't have any questions.
You don't have any question? Okay, no, because I thought that your hand was still raised. Okay. Then William said, could I clarify that I understood this correctly? Ikiosis and paracoluthima, and on the opposite side of, are on the opposite side of the ladder. Yeah, ikiosis and paracoluthima are on the opposite side of the ladder, with the latter being typical of the discursive thought that human possesses. Yes, correctly, you understood this correctly. So on the one hand, you have ikiosis. Human being also has ikiosis, of course, because it's a living thing, but ikiosis in the human being is not so strong. Human being, though, has for sure paracoluthis or paracoluthima, okay? And paracoluthima, when it is, when it represents the manner of being of a thing, is at the opposite end of the spectrum compared to full ikiosis. What if you're writing about writing? Oh, that's a very good question, Elliot. What if you're writing about writing? Then, if you want to answer this question, read Maurice Blanchot, okay? go look at Maurice Blanchot, and he's gonna give you a few interesting thoughts about your question. What if you are what if you are writing about writing? Because that's what Blanchot does. And in fact, Blanchot talks of writing as the unfolding of what we are. So, well, I don't want to get into that now, okay? Because it's the question that Elliot is posing, if one goes deep in it, is a very interesting question that opens up very interesting perspectives on what the human being is. Because ultimately, the problem with Plotinus is that one way or the other, it postulates that there is a single way to be human, of which the various acts of self-consciousness are deviations from. If we instead say that the human being is writing about writing, we're saying then that the human being is this inventive self-construction. And hence there is no script to respect. You are what you make yourself into. But this opens up a series of questions that I don't want to go into now, okay? But good question. So Elliot, go look at Blanchot. Wait a second, then. So human being a sick phenomenon, finds it difficult to find its own origin and originator in terms of, yeah, Marcel, yeah, you're right. In terms analogous to the ladder of being, yes, precisely. And the task that that Plotinus indicates for the human being is to go back to the principle, to the archi. We come from. So the human being, like anything else that is the result of an aphenos process. So a process of coming down from one, okay? What Plotinus wants to provide us with here is a recipe pros hen, that is to say, how to go back to this one, okay? So Marcel is right. The human being finds it difficult to find its own origin and originator, yes, and Plotinus provides us with a recipe to find the origin and originator. Then Yongchen, would the immersion into things, as represented by Kiosis, be akin to the state of flow described in psychology, since the latter also speaks of immersion into the moment as the key aspect of flow? Yeah, I'm not familiar with the state of flow described in psychology. I'm not familiar with it. I would have to read more. So if you can point out to me stuff to read, then I could give you a more informed answer about this. Okay?
Yeah. The part that I find most similar is that they did a project investigating what it is that brings humans the most fulfillment in life. And they found the most common thing to all the things that people love to do is this state which they immerse themselves in as something they found fulfilling.
I see. Well, if you can send me something to read so that I can understand better about this theory, let's call it this way, I'll be able to give you a more informed answer. Then Kok Tong says, is this act of vision unfolding as act of vision? What are you referring to precisely, Kok Tong?
So just now it was like the writing of the writing. So act of vision.
Yeah. The writing of the writing, yeah. No, not precisely. Because the act of vision that comes out of an act of vision doesn't happen through reflective self-consciousness, whereas the writing about writing happens through what I say. It happens through an act of self-reflection that is boosted up to a next level. So you become extremely self-conscious through self-reflection of what you're doing. Okay, in a certain way, another one that has done something similar to what Blanchot does is, what's his name? James Joyce in the Ulysses. What is the Ulysses? Is the attempt to follow step by step the unfolding of one's thought. So it's a hyper act of self-reflection, or an act of hyper self-reflection. Okay. Whereas the coming down of act of theory from act of vision from act of vision doesn't happen through self-reflection. It happens, as Plotinus has the power of growth say in chapter 4, it happens through a spontaneous production. Let's call it this way. The image that Plotinus uses, right? Say, I look at the ones that generated me, the power of growth says, and through this looking, I get shaped, and out of this getting shaped, the forms of the body come out of me. And then he makes the similitude with the geometricians, and he says, except that the geometricians have to draw. I don't have to draw anything. These lines of the body sort of fall out of me. Again, one can think of it in terms, again, of running. Think of it. When one runs, but when one does anything, right, there is a series of complex movements that is put in place, that unfolds, right? And yet, none of this happens through a willing act of thought, through an act of reflection. And yet it happens orderly. So what Plotinus is focusing on is this unfolding of life, which unfolds orderly, even though there is no directing and ratiocinating thinking. This goes back to something that Plotinus says at the end of chapter 3, when he says that the power of growth has act of vision, but not the act of vision that comes from logos, he says. And then he says, by logos, what I mean here is reasoning, ratiocination. And what is ratiocination? Is when you put things A and then B and then C, when you put things in a line, in a discourse. Okay? So let's stop here for today. What I propose you to do is this, is to stay a bit further on chapter 3 and 4, because these are really key chapters, before we go into chapter 5 and 6, the translation of which I already sent you. So next Tuesday, let's stay more on chapter 3 and 4. But what I want you to do is to reread them, read them in parallel with the commentary that you have, and we start Tuesday sessions with your questions, okay? With your questions regarding what we said today, with your questions regarding the 2 chapters, okay? All right. All right, guys. So I leave you now because I have to get ready for the next class.
Okay, thank you, Professor.
Bye.
See you. Bye.
See you. Bye.